invite our keynote speaker to be on stage to give the keynote address. Allow me to go through a little bit of a background on Dr. Lisa Handley. Now, Dr. Lisa Handley has provided electoral assistance in more than 20 countries, including Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Democratic Republic of Congo, Georgia, Libya, Lebanon, Nigeria, as well as other countries. And she provided such assistance in a capacity as a consultant on issues such as boundary delimitation, electoral system design, as well as minority voting rights. Dr. Lisa Handley is currently the president of Frontier International Consulting, an election consulting firm that specializes in voting rights as well as electoral boundary delimitation. Now, with much pleasure, let us have Dr. Lisa Handley.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. But I have a confession to make. When I was asked to come, I hesitated. And the reason that I hesitated is I live a very long way from here. It was a very long trip. However, I did a little bit of research and it took me about 5 minutes to decide that I really had to come. And the reason that I had to come was that delimitation right now in this country is very, very important. And I wanted to come and do what I could to help in this situation. My task this morning is to talk about international best practices in constituency delimitation. So I'm going to talk about the broad picture and not about Malaysia in particular. All those speakers after myself will do that. First, to emphasize my point about how important delimitation is, I'm going to give you a demonstration. What you see here is a village. This is a village with 25 voters in it. There are 15 X's and there are 10 O's. Every X we can assume will vote only for X's, and every O only for O's. And I'm going to move around and make this really difficult for you. So we're in, say, Lebanon, and the X's are Muslims and the O's are Christians, or we're in New Zealand and the O's are the Aboriginal population. The scenario I'm describing here happens in many, many countries. Now our task is, because this is a representative government, to draw 5 constituencies to elect 5 representatives for this village. And we can do this in many ways. Here's one way that we could do it. Here we have equal-sized constituencies. There's 5 people in each constituency. They're nice, compact districts. And what you produce from this, given the ground rules I've already set, is you elect 3 X's and 2 O's, so that the legislature reflects the body of voters that it represents. You could draw these lines another way. Here's another way. Now remember what I told you about X's only voting for X's and O's only voting for O's. I've now created districts that are equal in population. They look nice and compact, but now I've elected only X's to the legislature. The legislature is now 100% X's. Least you fear for O's. There's another way I can draw this. If I don't care very much about being equal in population, if I let a little bit of malapportionment in, and I let a lot of gerrymandering in, I've now produced a legislature which the majority of the representatives are actually O's, despite the fact that only 40% of the population in this particular example, just because of the way that I've drawn lines, O's now control the legislature. I'm using this to emphasize that it is very important how you draw the lines. The configuration of electoral boundaries has a major impact on the outcome of an election. How constituencies are drawn affects how many seats each political party holds and what party controls parliament. And the delimitation of constituencies is the single most important opportunity to manipulate the results of an election short of outright vote fraud. And in fact, it's a lot more efficient and a lot quicker than vote fraud. Most types of electoral systems draw constituencies. The only exception to that is a list proportional system, and even then, sometimes you end up drawing constituencies. You could have it so that the entire country was a single constituency, or you could draw constituencies. The importance of the delimitation system actually depends on the type of electoral system that you have. And it turns out that the delimitation process is most important if you have a system like the system you have here in Malaysia. If you have a first-past-the-post system that relies solely on single-member districts to elect your representatives, then delimitation plays a crucial role in who's going to be elected and who controls the legislature. If delimitation has such an impact, why even draw constituencies? Why not just have a PR system? By PR, I mean proportional representation. Well, constituencies offer a few advantages. And the first and most important advantage is that there is a direct link between the voter and his or her chosen representative. And it allows voters to keep that representative accountable. If that representative does not vote the way the voters in that constituency like, they can actually vote that person out. You do not have this in a list PR system. In a list PR system, the party puts together the list, you vote for a party, and the party decides who's going to sit in the legislature. Well, this isn't the case with single-member districts. You get to choose your legislature. It also facilitates communication and community service between you and your representative. And finally, so long as you insist that your representatives live within the constituency, it ensures geographic diversity within the legislature. Not everybody will come from a major city. What you find out a lot in PR systems is that the party list includes most of the people from the major city. Here, you would get a spread of representatives from across the country. But there are two major disadvantages to delimitation. One is that even without any sort of gerrymandering, single-member districts produce disproportional election results. The majority party tends to be overrepresented slightly in any single-member district. Second, delimitation is a complex process. It requires time, financial resources, and technical skills. And in a lot of countries, it's very difficult for the public to see what's happening, let alone to actually draw districts. What's been done here by Tindak is absolutely amazing. I haven't seen this in many countries that I've worked at all, that civil society can come up and draw their own districts. I'm going to focus on 5 international principles for delimitation: impartiality, equality, transparency, representativeness, and non-discrimination. These 5 principles are drawn from the Universal Declaration and other international treaties, and I'm going to talk about each in a little bit of detail, especially the first 2. By impartiality, I mean that the authorities involved in the delimitation process should be independent and nonpartisan. Now, the entities that could actually be assigned the task of drawing boundaries varies. It could be an election management body, like the EC here. It could be a boundary commission. It could be the legislature. It could even be an executive body. It used to be the case back in the 19th century that the legislature drew the boundaries in most countries that had representative government. But slowly, the legislature gave up this task because they obviously had a self-interest in the boundaries that were drawn, and election commissions or boundary commissions took over. This was the case in Australia, New Zealand, the UK. And in fact, almost all consolidated democracies have given the task of delimitation to either an impartial boundary commission or to the election commission itself. The United States remains one of the only, well, there are two, but it's one of two consolidated democracies that allows the legislature to keep drawing constituency boundaries. The result of that is gerrymandering left and right. And it's, although frowned upon, it is just absolutely expected that this would happen. Again, most countries have taken the task away from the legislature for precisely that reason, and then given it to an election and boundary commission. But that election and boundary commission, under international principles, should be independent, it should be nonpartisan, and by professional, I mean it should be efficient, competent, effective, accurate. It should be a professional body. Now, if Parliament is involved in the process at all, and it is sometimes when there, for example, a boundary commission draws the boundaries, sometimes the boundary commission is the final say on what the boundaries will be, sometimes it has to pass through Parliament. But if you're, for example, the UK, and you have a boundary commission, and you have to give the boundaries to Parliament to pass, Parliament passes it automatically. They have to pass it because it's a bill, but there's no debate, let alone any ability to tinker with the boundaries in most places that have a boundary commission or an election commission. You don't want Parliament to get involved in the process. You don't want the executive to get involved in the process because they have self-interest, and you can find that the boundaries can, even if they can't tinker with them, they can sit on the boundaries long enough so that they can force the election commission to redraw the boundaries. Finally, who gets to choose who has the final authority? It could rest with the boundary commission or the election commission. In other words, it may be the case that you cannot challenge the boundaries once they're drawn. It could rest with the legislature. The legislature passes it or doesn't pass it. Or most commonly, it's the judiciary that has the final say. For example, in the United States, if you draw some boundaries and you don't like them, you can go to court and challenge them. This is the case in a lot of countries. A couple of countries actually have constitutional provisions that say the courts have to stay out of the process, which means that the election commission has the final say. But in most countries, the judiciary has the final say. And that's good if the judiciary is impartial. It's not so good if it's not. In the United States, for example, the judiciary, you have a pretty good idea how the judiciary is going to find if you know who appointed the judges. So if you had a Republican president and he had appointed the judges, you could pretty much guess, like in Bush v. Gore, how that decision would come out. And by Bush, you know that our Supreme Court decided our election in 2000. We've already talked about gerrymandering, and the reason that you want an impartial election commission is because you want to avoid the potential of gerrymandering. You want to avoid the temptation of the boundary commission or the election commission or the legislature to draw boundaries that favor themselves at the expense of other groups. So, best practice. Ensuring impartiality, independence, and professionalism of bodies responsible for delimitation encourages stakeholders to accept the process as unbiased. This is particularly important because constituency boundaries have political consequences. And these consequences have to be perceived as unintentional if the election results are to be viewed as credible. equality. Populations of constituencies should be as equal as possible. This comes right out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says, the will of the people shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections that shall be universal by universal and equal suffrage. It's quite clear in a number of treaties and court cases that have followed that equal means, in the context of single member districts, that districts have to be equal in population. The criterion that districts be equal in population is the most widely accepted across all countries, and it's included in the constitutions of most countries that have single-member districts. However, the data that's used to determine equality of population, as well as the degree to which equality is required, varies depending on the country. The easiest way to go about figuring by data, I mean, many countries use population data, other countries use voter registration data. The UK, for example, uses voter registration data, as does Malaysia. In the US and a lot of other countries, they use census data. Okay. The way that we measure equality is by calculating the population quota, the number of census population or the voter registration population divided by the number of constituencies to be drawn gives you the population quota. And the deviation from that population quota is how you set the tolerance limit. So the tolerance limit is the highest deviation permissible from the population quota. Countries vary in the degree to which they accept deviation. More important point here is not a particular number, but setting a number and sticking to that number. So the United States, for example, for congressional districts, allows 0 deviation. You draw a congressional district, you better have the congressional district be equal as to one person. It has some downsides. You cut a lot of villages apart by doing that. Other countries, say 5–10%. Canada says 25%. Germany says 25%. Singapore says 30%, I think. Not only do you want to set a limit, but you have to set a time period. For example, you could say, okay, we have a limit of 10%, but then sit on the districts for 30 years, and they'll be pretty malapportioned by the end of those 30 years. So it's important that there be a trigger to cause delimitation to occur on a regular basis. Usually it's a mandatory time period. It could also be following a national census or prior to or before an election, so long as the delimitation is done sufficiently in advance of the election to be able to implement it and let the candidates and political parties know it. Or it could be that a prescribed level of malapportionment is reached. Kenya is the example that I'm going to use here. In 2007, after the election, you'll remember that there was a lot of violence. And a commission was sent into Kenya to figure out why we had so much election violence following the election. And the Quota Commission came up with some recommendations. And one of the most important recommendations they made was, you better go in and do some delimitation. They had drawn some lines back while it was still a colonial power. So these were lines that were drawn by the British back in the 50s, I think, the 1950s. And by the time of the election, you had districts that varied from 3,635 people to 100 times more than that at 301,558 people. And what that meant, there was a reason that the government had not redrawn the boundaries, and that was simply that their power came from the rural areas, so they liked lots of little districts that didn't have very many people in it, it ensured that they stayed in power. Best practice number 2. Equality of voting strength requires constituencies that are as equal in population as possible, the establishment of a population tolerance limit, and a mandatory time interval for delimitation deters malapportionment and guarantees voting equality, which helps to legitimize the outcome of elections. Third point, transparency. The delimitation process should be as transparent and accessible to the public as possible. I mentioned that inherent in a single-member district system is the fact that you will produce disproportionate election results more often than not. This is, while it's particularly important to make the process transparent, to make sure that the voters and other stakeholders know precisely what you're doing and why you're doing it. When we as international consultants go in, the UN brings me in somewhere, or IFAS brings me in somewhere, the ground rules are delimitation is not going to be a black box. We're going to have a public consultation process. And this public consultation process will involve at least 3 things. Number 1 is going to involve a voter education process. We want the voters to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. Number 2, we want stakeholders to be able to make comments. So we're going to hold public hearings around the country, and we're going to solicit comments on a set of provisional boundaries that we've drawn, if time allows. It may be the case that we are going in and actually looking to the public as to how we might combine various groups. But more often than not, the best way to do this is to put together a set of preliminary drawings and then go out and seek public comment on it. And the third part of this is once you do get public comment, and you do make some adjustments based on that, or not, as the case may be, when you produce the final report, you put in that report a section that talks about the comments you received and then actually gives justification for why you incorporated some of those comments and didn't incorporate other comments. For example, you may have a small community that says, we want to be our own constituency, and you say you can't do that because it violates one person, one vote rights. So best practice, transparency during delimitation is important for maintaining public confidence in the integrity of the process. Stakeholders are more likely to accept the delimitation process and its outcome if they have access to information about the process and input into the process. It doesn't need to be a black box. By representativeness, I mean the constituency boundaries should take into account communities of interest. If you can keep communities of interest intact, this makes the job of a representative much easier to represent the community that he or she is supposed to be representing. If you put together an arbitrary group of people who don't share common interests, it's much harder for the representative to represent this group. By communities of interest, I mean groups who are tied together either by territorial units, say for example they're an island or they're a valley, or groups that share common characteristics of common interests, such as a shared racial, ethnic, religious, or linguistic or cultural background. By administrative divisions, I mean subdivisions that are already in place that you might actually use as building blocks. Here, Tindak used polling areas as building blocks for their constituencies. In some places, we've used counties or chiefdoms in Africa a lot we use because we know that those groups are groups of common interests that share the same religion, the same language, the same cultural background. A couple of factors that are sometimes mentioned are compactness and contiguity. This is more to serve as a constraint on the boundary authority. If you see funny-shaped districts, you might suspect that something's going on. This is an example of a district drawn in the United States. This is a congressional district, which you might think that something's going on because it's pretty funny in shape and it's contiguous only in points. When the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, took a look at this, they decided that that district did in fact violate traditional redistricting principles. Redistricting is what we call delimitation in the United States, and they were forced to redraw it. Another way I mentioned in Sierra Leone, we used chiefdom boundaries, territorial units, as our way to create constituencies. And as part of the public consultation process, we would go out into the field and we would call together the paramount chiefs and we'd say, okay, your chiefdom isn't big enough to form its own constituency. You're going to have to select some chiefdoms in the general area. What do you think of being combined with this chiefdom? And the answer was, well, not that chiefdom because they used to eat us. How about that chiefdom over there? In this way, we slowly but surely built a map which actually had a lot of support. There was some problems with the election, but it wasn't a problem of the constituency boundaries. Here's an example of constituency boundaries that divide communities. You can see that not a single one of these communities, the orange community is divided up, the purple community is divided up. Best practice number 3. Okay, it's 4. The boundary authority should be obliged to take into account geographically concentrated communities of interest. This makes the task of representing voters easier, and like the criterion of population equality, it serves as a check on the discretion of the boundary authority to draw constituency boundaries that are unbiased. The last international principle I want to look at is non-discrimination. Constituencies should not be drawn in a manner that discriminates against minority voters. Here's an example from my own country. For a long time, blacks in the American South couldn't vote. And so how you drew the constituency boundaries didn't matter. And we had a heavy black population along the Mississippi River. This was old plantation country. And this stood in the South until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1965, it suddenly dawned on the Mississippi State Legislature that if they kept the boundaries like this, they had one district that was majority black in population. And that district could elect a black to office. That was not going to be acceptable. So they redrew the lines, and they made them horizontal rather than vertical, and they took this heavily black population, and they divided it among 3 districts, so that the black population predominated in not a single congressional district. So despite the fact that the state of Mississippi was nearly 40% black, they didn't elect a single black congressional representative. It took 20 years before the Supreme Court, I'm exaggerating slightly, 15 years before the Supreme Court finally said, that's the discrimination, you cannot do that, you have to go back and redraw the boundaries in the traditional manner, and Mississippi was able to elect a black congressman for the first time in 1982. Now, that works only if you have geographically concentrated minorities, like you did in Mississippi. If your minorities are more dispersed, then drawing districts in which minorities compose a majority of the voters is not going to be possible. In that case, if you have minorities that are disadvantaged that you want to protect, the only way to do that is to put into place special provisions such as reserved seats or reserved constituencies. A single-member district first past the post system is not good for minorities that are not geographically compact. Last best practice. Provisions against discriminatory constituency delimitation serve to protect minority groups that are geographically concentrated from being fragmented across constituencies. If constituencies are gerrymandered in a discriminatory manner, minority voters will view the delimitation process as biased and unfair and are unlikely to support either the process or the election outcome. In conclusion, constituency boundaries have political consequences. If voters and other stakeholders suspect the boundaries have been unfairly manipulated to produce a certain political outcome, this will affect the credibility of the delimitation process and ultimately the legitimacy of the election process. It is important to devise and carry out a delimitation process exercise that complies with the international principles of impartiality, equality, transparency, representativeness, and non-discrimination.